virtual board here. And I know it looks odd. I'm sort of off to one side, but there is a reason for that. I'll explain in a second. So this is the first series of videos I'm hoping to do. Many of you probably know me as Linus Bork, and probably know me as Mr. Horizon or Mr. View, as historically as I've been called, kind of thing. A lot has changed over the years. Last 15 years or so, I've done Horizon, or View as it first was called, or actually VDM, Virtual Desktop Manager, then it became View, and then Horizon, and a whole variety of renames, along with Horizon Cloud App Volumes and a few other things. And I've taken on a new role. I'm now a technical learning engineer, senior technical learning engineer at staff or something like that. Anyway, some spectacular title. And as part of it, I'm sort of switching my focus. I'm actually getting away from EUC and getting back into core products, which requires me to relearn a few things. It has been a long time since I've actually touched vSphere itself on a more than occasional basis for whenever I had to touch it for Horizon. So I'm sort of relearning things. And I thought it might be a good idea to actually create some blog entries and some videos like this one on how clouds work, on how VCF works, on how HCX works, on a whole bunch of other acronymed products, Tanzu probably as well, maybe some Converter, maybe some Skyline, a whole bunch of stuff like that. So this is the first of what I'm hoping will be a series of videos that I'll do. And I thought it might be a good idea. I was talking with my mentee. I mentor a couple of employees at VMware. I thought it might be a neat idea to step back a little bit. Let's talk about the history of how we got to where we are today, right? And so that's part of why I'm sitting sort of at the side, because I have all of this space, still getting used to which way my camera is, to draw in. And so I've done some fancy magic stuff, and I'll probably do a few more magic stuff with this. But let's start with the basics. So prior to, and we'll pick 1998, as soon as I can draw here. There we go. 1998. So, pre that time period, what did we have? Well, most environments had a physical system, which had CPU, it had memory, it had disk, and it had network. My iPad doesn't want to work with me sometimes. It also had GPU, right? Very basic GPU is usually just for the basics. It was a server. Why do you need GPU? It didn't even have a sound card in most cases, right? We had closets full of these things, or in large organizations, they had huge data centers, with thousands of physical computers. And it cost a lot of money. You had this huge data center, it was doing all of this stuff. And I picked 1998 as a specific reason, because that's when, of course, VMware was founded. And so this is the way that we sort of started. I'm back when I was an IT admin, way back in the day. My data center was literally in a closet. I had a domain controller, and it also acted as a file server. I had about 400, 500 students. I had about 20 staff. So I didn't need anything massive, and we had the tape backup, which, interestingly enough, didn't work, of course, because no one had bothered to check the tape until I did, and they weren't willing to spend the money. That's a whole different discussion, of course, right? What I call Larry and Larry 9. But I bring up these four down here at the bottom, specifically what we often refer to, what I call the four food groups, right? Every computer needs those four things, kind of idea. And so looking forward, if that was the world that we were going to be in, our data centers would get bigger and bigger and bigger, even as computers get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Like today you can have a NUC that, it's like this big kind of thing. And it can run a whole host of things on it. It's pretty powerful. You don't need to have the old-fashioned towers that were at the feet and what I call the feet warmers. I live in Canada, so of course it's a foot warmer, right? Kind of thing. But you needed something, kind of idea. So 1998 is when VMware first gets founded. and introduces a whole new concept, right? And so back then it was, referred to as an ESX server. And on the ESX server was, of course, the hypervisor, which is the VM kernel. Now, it back then had something known as the service console, which was a modified Red Hat. I remember because I was in support at the time. I started around the time of 2025 kind of thing. But as time has evolved, it added a few things. Now, the first thing that existed on it was hostd. Hostd actually allowed us sort of a command line communication point, if you will. So commands I did at the command line in the service console, or through the MUI, as it was called, which was the web interface. It was I'm really dating myself right now. A really cool interface that gave us sort of, ideas of what was going on within the system and so on, kind of thing. So you would access it through the MUI, and that was, the MUI through the browser. I laugh at this because we're back to a browser again, right? You'd either go through the MUI or you'd go through the CLI to talk to the ESXi host, right? So stop a VM, power on a VM, create a snapshot, or, well, they weren't called snapshots back then. They were called redo files, right? Create a redo file, stop the redo file, delete the redo file, all of that type of stuff, kind of thing. But the VM kernel is the important piece, excuse me, in that it is the piece that allowed us to basically have, of course, our VM. Come on. This tool is kind of neat, but I'm still figuring out the limits of it. And the VM itself, come on, I think I need a new pointer for my iPad pen, would talk to the VM kernel. And the VM kernel would decide, all right, you have access to, the CPU, or you have access to memory. Let's erase that. We'll try that again. Or to the NIC, or to, actually, we won't call it a disk, we'll call it, the VMFS, because back then it was just VMFS, right? So you had a single ESXi host, and it would have multiple VMs on it. Great. So you would build another box, and you would build more VMs on it. And another box, and you build more VMs on it. That's a problem, right? So let me move this over a little bit, kind of thing. Because as you build more ESXi hosts, of course, right, it becomes a challenge. Going into each one through the MUI was, that's not going to work. Oh, come on, pen. My pen decides when it wants to work and when it doesn't want to work. All right. And so, starting in 2.5, we introduced a new thing. I'll erase that out of there. Go away. Come on. We introduced a new thing called Virtual Center. And this allowed us, we would actually install the VPXA agent on there, and on the Virtual Center would run the VPXD daemon. And I'll admit to this, it actually did run on WinXP, or a server version of Windows Server. It was early 2000s, what can we say, right? VPXA, which was the agent that ran on the ESX host, would then talk to hostd and talk to the kernel and so on and so on, right? So environments, hey, great, now we have this, and there's this thing, this new feature, functionality, called, of course, vMotion. Whoops, that's the limit of the screen, so I'll write it down here. So it introduced vMotion, which was the coolest thing under the sun. Oh, I can move VMs while they're still powered on from one host to the other, right? Very cool, kind of thing. And so we have gone from large data centers to smaller data centers because we can now have lots of VMs on all these ESX hosts. And then we're going back to big data centers because, of course, now I can run even more hosts more VMs on more hosts within the environment, and especially with something like vMotion kind of thing. And that was 2.5. 3 sort of changed things, right? So we got a whole new look of the environment as to what we're going to do, right? So VI3 was introduced, and with that came a rename. So it wasn't Virtual Center anymore, it became vCenter. That's when we started introducing the whole V in front of products, right? And vCenter added in a few things. So one of the biggest, of course, was the distributed virtual switch, right? So now I could add my ESXi hosts to here. I'll attach them to the switch, be able to manage them better. And of course, a rename, this became an ESXi host, which was originally, you had ESX, come on, ESX, and then you had ESXi. The I stood for installable, right? Originally it was in brackets, and then they removed the brackets kind of thing, but essentially the idea was that you could have a version that was on a USB stick, and or your vendor would provide it for you, right? It would have it pre-installed on hardware. Right? That was the idea. And so we started seeing environments get bigger and bigger, and they had multiple vCenters, and they had thousands of ESXi hosts, and they were using, the distributive switches, and of course, DRS and HA became very popular, right? Hey, I can really, minimize the time that I had to be up in case there was an outage, etc., kind of thing. But for some environments, the number of vCenters that they had became huge. I mean, we're not talking about like 3 or 4 ESXi hosts. We're talking about 3 or 4,000 ESXi hosts, which meant lots of vCenters. And so eventually we got to the point where we were able to, let me make this a little bit smaller. Oops. I think I had dead spots on my iPad glass. There we go. Where we were able to link vCenters together, kind of thing, right? So that you could sort of manage things as things go on, etc., to make it easier. But it was still a challenge, right? So as things continued with this kind of thing, environments grew, etc., an interesting thing happened, and this was probably around 2010, 2011. Now, it's not the exact dates that these things appeared. I'd actually have to check and see, but a few big players started to appear, and that was AWS, Azure, of course, and Google Cloud Engine, right? Public clouds, right? Kind of thing. I don't like the small, thin lines. Right, so public cloud made its appearance. Everyone said, oh, it's the end of VMware, you're going to die. No one will want to use it on premise. Not a true statement, right? Because the challenge, of course, is how do I migrate my loads over, right? Although we are still part of the open virtual, OVF? Open virtual file, open virtual format. Where the structure of a VM is the same, and so I could import it from one platform to another and back again, kind of thing. A lot of people, once they were tied into VMware, they didn't want to leave, right? I mean, it provided a lot of functionality. There's a lot of things that came with it. And there's a few things that happened, and it was around, I want to say around 2011, 2012. So if we go back to, and I'll make it simple. We'll just make a vCenter, right? We'll have, it keeps opening up my colors. So the little pink boxes, these are ESXi hosts. I'll just put ESX because it's easier. I still call them ESX hosts. I always forget the I sometimes. And of course, our distributive switch, right? But there are a few new things started to appear around that time, and it goes from about 2011 to about 2014. that some of this stuff appeared. So one of the first things that appeared that sort of got added in was, and I have to choose a color because if I do anything fancy with the background, I don't want it to fade out, was the introduction of something called NSX, right? Virtual networking. This idea that we could virtualize not just our distributed switches, but hey, we could do a distributive firewall. We could do distributive gateways. We could do distributive load balancers, right? As objects, as abstract objects within an environment, kind of thing. And then on the other side, or the lower side of things, if you will, choose orange for it. And oddly enough, this is something that I find really interesting. The introduction of virtual storage, right? vSAN. Now, what's interesting about vSAN is vSAN was actually created originally for Horizon. Excuse me, originally actually, oddly enough, for link clones. It was a technology that was used for Horizon to create lots of small VMs that didn't use a lot of space, kind of thing. Hugely popular. From version, let me see here, Peace Over Peak came out with 3.1, so it was around that time. So from 3.1 up until version 8, where they were officially deprecated, we used link clones as a main thing. And then starting with version 7 and onwards, we introduced instant clones as an alternative, which is a neat way of doing it. But vSAN was actually kind of, was introduced originally as something, and it didn't take off really at the beginning. It's certainly taken off a lot more. Because the big thing that we found was that a lot of these ESXi hosts, the physical host, had storage on it that wasn't being used. And so what we said was, well, what if we virtualized that, right? And made it appear as one volume and shared it out. It's pretty nifty, right? So here we are, somewhere in the 2010s, right? Early 2010s, with all of this going on. Now, at the same time, there was another product that came out. Choose red for that one. And it was actually originally a sort of family of products, but the main one was VCD, or vCloud Director, right? So vCloud Director could take templates and push them out through vCenter to the ESXi hosts, which is really cool. But tied with it, interesting enough, there was, something known as chargeback, which was kind of neat because the idea was, one of the big issues in IT is that we've always been a cost center, right? Chargeback says, look, you can create a front end, have your users do self-service, and charge them back for the cost of the server. Cool, right? It was actually a pretty neat idea. But in order to really make this work, vCloud Director by itself, you can create templates, push them out, etc. You can create a front end because it did have an API. The big key, and it's not in here, I'm not showing it yet, was, and it was originally called vCenter Orchestrator, so I'll just call them Orchestrator now because they've been renamed. Orchestrator and Automation. Now Area, or what used to be vRealize, now Area. So Area Orchestrator, Area Automation, Area Login Site, whatever, the family of Area products. This is probably the big final piece. And what this started allowed people to do is to create an on-premise cloud, right? So up until this point, we've been doing straight virtualization. We've been virtualizing the data center. We virtualize the storage, virtualize CPU, virtualize the memory, virtualize the network. To truly make it a cloud, right? That in itself is not a cloud. The thing that makes it a cloud is this, because it introduces the ability for self-service, right? An employee can make a request for a bunch of VMs that do a bunch of things, kind of idea. Pretty nifty. Now, at the same time that all of this was happening, an interesting little thing was happening elsewhere. And that was the introduction of what we call containers, right? So what is a container? Well, let's start with what is an app. kind of thing. So I'm going to use the white for this. So if we have an OS, right? So whatever the OS is. Oh, come on, OS. I'm sorry, I have really bad handwriting sometimes. I could have been a doctor. And I'll use Windows because it's probably the easiest one to sort of show this with. And I'll just type Hive here. So when an app runs, and actually I'm missing one more thing. Where am I going to put this? Hive. See, let me redraw that. We'll make it a little bit better than that. It's always fun trying this. I've been drawing this for like the last 3 days, and I figured I had it down pat, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to change this while I'm doing this and recording it. Let's try this again. We'll just do CPU and memory up here. Whatever the OS is, right? And then the app. Now the app, when it runs, it will send processes off to the CPU, and anything that it can't do right away gets stored into memory, right? Or anything that it needs later gets stored into memory. Anything that it's not able to, if it really doesn't need it right away, doesn't need it in memory, it will send it down to the swap file and keeps it in the swap file itself, kind of thing. And that's essentially how they work. So someone said, well, do we really need the bottom stuff, right? Like, could we get rid of this, in essence, and just have the app like this? And so they did, right? That's what we call containers. And so if we look at what a container is, oh, come on, my erase, it's really picky. If I lift up my pen, it stops erasing. So I have to be very specific. We'll get rid of all this stuff here. Go away. It's going. Almost there. There we go. Got the last one. Sweet. So what happens now is we containerize the OS. And on top of it, we'll run our app. Right. Now, it may not seem like a big deal, but here's the thing. This doesn't run as a VM. It runs as almost like a service on top of the hypervisor, or even directly on top of bare metal, kind of thing. And so that means that now my apps are isolated. They're not tied to the OS. They're not tied to, the hooks that I have to put in to, the hooks I have to put in to make calls for things, etc. They are actually running as a service, if you will, on top of the OS, in this special sort of container kind of thing. And it means more efficient use of resources. It means when it comes to updating, even better. Because now, if I have an update, so let's say this is my update, right? I can just slot it in. If my app is made up of, say, 3 layers, I can just replace the layer that has to be replaced rather than the whole thing and redoing the whole OS and hooks and all of that. And that's one of the big benefits out of it. It allows modern apps to really be able to run almost anywhere. Now, this was introduced around 2015 at that time, and this is the same time that we started seeing on-premise clouds starting to sort of take off, right? So now for organizations, they could create apps, push them out to their local systems, and be able to expand it. But there's only so much they can do. And it started getting complicated because, of course, you have NSX and there's controls over that. The networking team's like, no, don't do this. We don't want this. We don't want this. We don't want this. And, of course, cost, right? So where does that leave us? Well, let's take that all out, right? So let's draw really high level kind of thing. And I really do like this weird pink. It's kind of fun. So on-prem, we have our on-prem data center, right? And it is a cloud at this point, right? Quite often when we include the automation pieces, we have that. And then out in the public, we'll have a cloud as well, right? But here's the mistake that everyone did. They said, oh, let's move all of this out to here, and we're gonna save, right? It's gonna go poof, right? We'll save some money on this. Yeah, no. Because they moved so much out, and because, of course, they wanted to have the redundancies for it, what ended up happening was it started costing a lot more, right? And I won't get into the differences of the different clouds, and I have an opinion on that. I think some clouds are cheaper than others, but that's not always the case, kind of thing. Right. And so what's happening now is we're seeing the exact opposite, right? As people move their load from the cloud back to on-premise. Now that's an easy answer. Everyone says, oh, it's the end of public clouds, everything's going away. That's not true. What we're starting to see is that some things are being put back into the data center itself. So what we are starting to see is more, critical apps, sensitive apps, that maybe have proprietary info, etc., that maybe really shouldn't have been in the cloud to begin with, right? From a Horizons perspective, I used to always say, you don't need to have every user out in the cloud. Put the ones that make the most sense, right? The easiest low-hanging fruit is often what I would suggest, right? Call center. Poof. They're all the same image 1,000 times over, and if they're all working from home, why not? Stick them in the cloud, put them on Azure, have it only powered on when the user is using it, power it off otherwise. With Azure, you only pay for what's powered on. Why not, right? And by starting to do that, this started to happen. Now, it's not just, it's not just about, the cost of the cloud itself, but there is an additional cost that is often overlooked, and that is operational costs, right? Because vSphere on-premise, everyone already knows how to do that. People have done that for years. Even I know how to do it. I mean, I just did, and I'll have a link hopefully in the channel for this. We just did the exam prep for the VCP DCV, and I did the Kahoot thing, and I didn't fare as well as I thought I would. I came second, so I'm quite pleased with that. But things have certainly changed over the years. But the idea of how vSphere works and how vCenter works and how NSX and vSAN, a lot of that hasn't changed. Yes, they've added more bells and whistles to them, kind of thing, but that really hasn't changed anything, kind of idea. And so where does this come into play? How do I get my stuff from the cloud, public cloud specifically, right? This is public cloud. How do I get my stuff from public cloud back to my data center that I want to use? Well, that's where some of the things I will be probably looking after over the next little while. So HCX is the tool that we use to do large migrations. So you can move a whole workload from one side to the other and back again, kind of thing. If I want to build my cloud out, I want to build out workloads for, say, things like Tanzu or what have you, then I'll use something like VCF. And VCF is the full stack, so to speak. Right, oh, come on. I'm going to have arguments with my iPad pen after I'm done this. Yay, VCF, right? This is the full stack, so I can really create that full on-premise cloud that I want, be able to manage it and so on within the environment. There's still some old-fashioned tools that are still out there, not quite so old-fashioned. I remember, it's funny because someone had said to me, we need someone to look after this, talk about this converter. I remember being on the beta team when it was first released, right? That's our P2V tool. It's still out there, right? So take physical to virtual. You can also, if you're really sneaky about it, do V2V if you need to, kind of thing. So that's still as an option. And then, what am I missing? So Tanzu would be on your on-premise cloud. And there's one more thing that I wanted to mention. Oh, yes. So you have all of this, right? It's a lot to manage. How are you gonna deal with things when things go wrong? And that's where there's one more piece that we really do need to talk about. And I'll definitely be making videos for this. So to help you, a lot of our cloud products actually have it built in on the back end of it, actually have a visibility that support can see. So they could be actually proactive about things. I know for Horizon Cloud, they've done that a few times where they've notified a customer, hey, your DNS is wrong, or your VNets on Azure are wrong, or whatever, right? These things need to be fixed. And you can do that for your on-premise. And there's a few ways that this works, but the family of things, as it's called, would be Skyline. So Skyline lets VMware support sort of see into your environment and help you be proactive about things before they become problems, so that we do not have resume generating events, right? We don't want any RGEs, right? That's bad, kind of thing. We want to keep our jobs within the environment. And so that's where we are today, right? It's changed a lot from the very beginning days where you had a single ESXi host with a few VMs on it to now you have thousands of ESXi hosts, you have hundreds of vCenters, and you have a bunch of containers all over the place with thousands of apps. And they're moving back and forth as to whatever the need is, right? Public cloud isn't going away. Neither is on-prem. I think the problem that we've seen is we've seen too much put into public cloud and the realization that we need to move some of it back. I think the challenge that we're starting to see is that people, the CIOs and all of those three-letter acronym exec levels, cloud is a great thing, but only if it's deployed properly and only deployed, only when it's considered properly, right? We have to actually do things like designing for it, figure out what is acceptable within the organization. We have things like RPOs and RTOs, right? So, oops, I always forget that that's up there. Let's try a different color. A very colorful chart. There we go. RTO, RPO, right? So, the amount of time it takes between a failure event to recovery, and then the actual cost of that kind of thing. We want to minimize those as much as possible, but the reality is if I want my environment up within a few seconds, I am paying lots and lots of money, what I call the layer 8, layer 9 of the OSI model, right? Budget and politics kind of thing. We want to make sure that we have, what's appropriate for our organization, as it were. So that is a brief history of cloud and a little bit about what VMware is. It's sort of timely and everything that's going on these days as to what's coming up kind of thing. So it's a high-level view, right? My goal, we'll see how good I'm at this. I admit I have lofty ideas and sometimes I get bogged down in little details, is to spend time on this, on this, on this, a little bit on this. Probably not as much. I'll leave that for Joel and Matt to focus on kind of thing. And then some things that aren't necessarily in here or aren't visible or things like Tanzu kind of thing, and probably a few other things. So less on the EUC. I might still pop in an occasional EUC thing because I still love it. I still think Horizon's a pretty cool tool and Horizon Cloud is pretty nifty. But we'll probably start seeing some of these coming out over the next few weeks. And they may either be a video or they may be a blog entry. We'll see how I do them. So hopefully it's been interesting. Hopefully it's been helpful. I had figured this might be helpful for someone who might be new to virtualization and to cloud as a general thing. And just sort of maybe just even a little bit of history. Right? I always love history topics, kind of idea. All right, so that's it for me for today, and we'll see you next time.